The Life of Dwight L. Moody, Chapter 16. First Extended Mission in Great Britain. So great was the interest at the tabernacle that the work went on unabated during Mr. Moody's absence while working in behalf of the new building. Finding, therefore, that he could be spared from Chicago, and desiring to learn more of the Bible from English Bible students, Mr. Moody determined to cross the sea again. He started for a short trip in June 1872. This visit calls for special consideration on account of one incident that undoubtedly marked another turning point in Mr. Moody's career. He was determined not to get into work if he could help it, but one day at the close of the service in the Old Bailey prayer meeting, the Reverend Mr. Lessey, pastor of a church in the north of London, asked him to preach for him the next Sabbath. Mr. Moody consented. The morning service seemed very dead and cold. The people did not show much interest, and he felt that it had been a morning lost. But at the next service, which was at 6:30 in the evening, it seemed while he was preaching as if the very atmosphere was charged with the Spirit of God. There came a hush upon all the people, and a quick response to his work, though he had not been much in prayer that day and could not understand it. When he had finished preaching, he asked all who would like to become Christians to rise that he might pray for them. People rose all over the house until it seemed as if the whole audience was getting up. Mr. Moody said to himself, "These people don't understand me. They don't know what I mean when I ask them to rise." He had never seen such results before and did not know what to make of it, so he put the test again. "Now," he said, "all of you who want to become Christians, just step into the inquiry room." They went in and crowded the room so that they had to take in extra chairs to seat them all. The minister was surprised, and so was Mr. Moody. Neither had expected such a blessing. They had not realized that God can save by hundreds and thousands, as well as by ones and twos. When Mr. Moody again asked those who really wanted to become Christians to rise, the whole audience got up. He did not even then know what to do, so he told all who were ready in earnest to meet the pastor there the next night. The next day he went over to Dublin, but on Tuesday morning received a dispatch urging him to return, saying that there were more inquiries on Monday than on Sunday. He went back and held meetings for 10 days, and 400 were taken into the church. After some time, what was perhaps the secret of this marvelous manifestation of the Spirit's working was revealed. There were two sisters belonging to that church. One was strong, the other was bedridden. One day, as the sick woman was bemoaning her condition, the thought came to her that she could at least pray, and she began to pray God to revive her church. Day and night her prayer went up to God. One day she read in the paper an account of some meetings Mr. Moody had held in America, and though she did not know him, she began to pray that God would send him to her church. On the Sunday Mr. Moody preached, her sister went home and said, "Whom do you think preached this morning?" She suggested the names of several with whom her pastor was in the habit of exchanging. Finally, her sister told her it was Mr. Moody from America. "I know what that means," cried the sick woman. "God has heard my prayers." Mr. Moody believed that it was this revival that carried him back to England the next year. Among other meetings, he attended the Mid-May Conference, and thus records his impression of the Reverend William Pennefather, the founder of Midley. "I well remember sitting in yonder seat looking up at this platform and seeing the beloved Mr. Pennefather's face illuminated as it were with heaven's light. I don't think I can recall a word that he said, but the whole atmosphere of the man breathed holiness, and I got then a lift and impetus in the Christian life that I have never lost, and I believe the impression will remain with me to my dying day. I thank God that I saw and spoke with that holy man. No one could see him without the consciousness that he lived in the presence of God." It was the first and last time they ever met. Mr. Pennefather was strongly impressed with the conviction that Mr. Moody was one for whom God had prepared a great work, and after his return to America, he wrote him, telling him of the wide open door for evangelical work in London and elsewhere, and promising him a warm welcome if he ever would come over and help them. Other invitations, equally cordial, were received about the same time from Cuthbert Bainbridge of Newcastle-on-Tyne and Henry Brayley of Dublin. These were accompanied with the promise of funds to meet the traveling expenses of Mr. Moody and his party. After arriving for the work in which he had been engaged in Chicago, it was decided to accept his invitation and to return to England for a short visit. Philip Phillips, a warm personal friend of Mr. Moody, was at this time the leading gospel singer in America, and Mr. Moody at once urged him to accompany him. This he was not able to do, and P.P. Bliss, whose reputation as a gospel solo singer and composer had commanded a demand for his services on all sides, was then invited. He had been associated with Mr. Moody on several occasions, and both men were closely attached to each other. But in this he was also disappointed, as it seemed impossible for Mr. Bliss to leave home. It was Mr. Moody's first idea to leave Mr. Sankey in Chicago to continue to work in the mission church and in the association. Finally, however, he decided that the British call was of sufficient importance to take Mr. Sankey with his work for a few months at least. Mr. Moody had at that time about $450, which he had loaned to a friend to be invested during his absence, as all his expenses on the mission were to be met by those who had invited him. Steamship passage for Mr. Moody and his family and Mr. Sankey had been engaged, but the promised funds failed to come. Within a day or two of the time for departure, Mr. Moody had to request the return of his loan to meet traveling expenses. On reaching Liverpool on June 17, 1873, the cause for the non-receipt of the promised funds was at once apparent. All three of the cordial and devoted friends on whose invitation Mr. Moody had depended for moral and financial support had been called to be with their Lord. After reading the letter announcing the death of these friends, Mr. Moody turned to Mr. Sankey and said, God seems to have closed the doors. We will not open any ourselves. If he opens the door, we will go in. Otherwise, we will return to America. On their arrival at Liverpool, they went to a hotel, where they spent the evening. Mr. Moody then discovered in one of his pockets an unopened letter which he had received just before leaving New York from Mr. Bennett, the secretary of the Young Men's Christian Association at York, England. Mr. Bennett said that he had heard of his work in America among young men, and he hoped if he ever came to England he would come there and speak at the association. This door is only ajar, Mr. Moody explained, but we will consider the letter as God's hand leading to York, and we will go there. After spending one night in Liverpool, Mr. Moody, with his family, took the train for London, and Mr. Sankey went to Manchester to the home of the one man whom he knew in England, Henry Morehouse. On receiving Mr. Moody's dispatch that he was ready to begin his meetings in York, Mr. Bennett replied that everything was so cold and dead in the town that it would take at least a month to prepare for the intended mission. The dispatch concluded by asking Mr. Moody to name a date that he could consult him regarding the proposed meetings. With his usual promptness, his telegram was sent in reply. I will be in York tonight. At 10 o'clock that evening he reached the city, where no one except his friend Mr. Bennett had ever seen him, and very few had ever heard his name. The situation was not encouraging, but after looking it over carefully, Mr. Moody declared that every man must make his own way, and that he was ready to go in at once. Mr. Sankey was telegraphed for, and the meetings opened immediately. The next morning, application was made to several ministers of the town for the use of their pulpits in the coming Sabbath, and 2 Wesleyan, a Baptist, and a Congregational church was placed at their disposal. It is interesting to look through the files of the religious papers for the 2 years that covered Mr. Moody's campaign in Great Britain. In some of the later issues, double numbers were published, the extra pages being devoted entirely to articles concerning the great meetings. In contrast with these extensive reports is the following modest little notice in one corner of The Christian, entitled Mr. D. L. Moody in England. Mr. Moody has just arrived in England with his family and is accompanied by a Christian brother who leads the singing at his meetings, after the manner of the well-known and much-loved friend, Philip Phillips. Mrs. Moody and her children remain with her sister in the neighborhood of London while her husband is holding meetings in the Providences. Last Lord's Day, he preached in Independent and Wesleyan chapels in York, and we believe that he intends to continue a while in the north of England and then go to Scotland. He prefers preaching in chapels and so strengthening existing causes to commencing a new work in public halls, etc. Any friends who desire his help, especially in the North, should write him at once. Young Men's Christian Association, York. We will notify change of address from week to week as we receive it from him. The clergy at first were strongly inclined to look upon the newcomers with suspicion and disfavor, and the attendance was small to begin with. But gradually the meetings grew in interest, the clergy cooperated, and both preaching and singing became the subject of public conversation throughout the community. Mr. Moody wrote from York on June 30th to Mr. Farwell of Chicago as follows. You will see by the heading of this note that I am in York. I began here 1 week ago yesterday, Sunday, and had had splendid success so far. Yesterday we had 4 meetings. They were large and I think very profitable. God was with us. I preached in the morning on They that be wise shall shine, in the afternoon on No difference, and in the evening from the text, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel. Sankey sang the hymns finely, as seems to be much pleased with him. All seem to be much pleased with him. I think he is going to do much good here. All the chapels are open to us, and invitations are coming from all over the country. I think we shall have all we can do here. I think of you all and get fearfully homesick at times. Keep me posted in regards to the Young Men's Christian Association building and all about the stock. I should like to see a good building go up there. I do not see any better opportunity to work for Christ than in that field. I do not know what is to become of the Young Men's Christian Association in England and America if something of the kind is not done. I send you some flower seeds. I think the one marked 1-6 is beautiful, and never have seen anything in America like it. I hope you will have success with them. Remember me to Wells and all your family. Yours through the grace of God. Yes, I have known Mr. Moody ever since the memorable Monday morning on 1873. Writes to Reverend F.B. Myers, who was among the first to associate himself with the movement. I can see him now standing up to lead the first noon prayer meeting in a small, ill-lit room in Coney Street, York, little realizing that it was the seed germ of a mighty harvest and that a movement was beginning that would culminate in a few months in Free Assembly Hall, Edinburgh, and ultimately in the Agriculture Hall of the Royal Opera House, London. It was the birth time of new conceptions of ministry, new methods of work, new inspirations and hopes. What an inspiration when this great and noble soul first broke into my life. I was a young pastor then in the old city of York, and bound rather rigidly by the chains of conventionalism. Such had been my training, and such might have been my career, but here was a revelation of a new ideal. The first characteristic Mr. Moody's that struck me was that he was so absolutely unconventional and natural. That a piece of work had generally been done under a certain method would probably be the reason why he would set about in some fresh and unexpected way. That the new method startled people was the greater reason for continuing it, if only it drew them to the gospel. But there was never the slightest approach to irreverence, fanaticism, or extravagance. Everything was in perfect accord with a rare common sense, a directness of method, a simplicity and transparency of aim, which were as attractive as they were fruitful in result. The first 10 days of his meetings were only moderately successful, and he gladly accepted my invitation to come to the chapel where I ministered, and there we had a fortnight of most blessed and memorable meetings. The little vestry there, how vividly I remember it, was the scene of our long and earnest prayers as we knelt around the leather-covered table in the middle of the room. 2 Presbyterian students, brothers from Dr. McKay's church in Hull, often used to pray with us, and I remember that Mr. Moody, at the Great Free Trade Hall, Manchester, referred to that little room as the fountain from which the river of blessing for a whole country had sprung. Many recollections of these days come back as I write, how in the midst of tea at home, Mr. Moody suddenly felt that he should preach his afterward famous sermon on heaven, and started off on a 3-mile walk to fetch his notes. How Mr. Sankey went over to see Mr. Rees of Sutherland, the sailor preacher, to whom I had introduced them, and proved his singing powers in the little back parlor of a butcher's shop, to the entire satisfaction of both minister and elder. How we had our all-day meeting, the first of its kind in England, and how the fire of God burned hot, in all our hearts. Ah, blessed days, that will live as long as memory endures, days of heaven, of wonder, of a new and brilliant constellation in one sphere, of the beginning of a lifelong devotion to another man, which has only ripened and deepened with every succeeding year. The first public record of the meeting in York appeared in The Christian for July 10th in a letter from Mr. Bennett, who said, "The following notes of our brother D.L. Moody's evangelistic labors in this city will doubtless be welcomed by your readers. On Sunday morning, June 22nd, Mr. Moody preached in Salem Congregational Chapel to Christian workers in the afternoon in the Corn Exchange to about 1,000 persons, and in the evening at Wesley Chapel. Many were impressed. Every evening during the following week, Bible lectures were delivered in various chapels, each service resulting in the saving of souls, but especially in the quickening of believers. Formality and apathy are to a great extent dissipated, and Christians have been led to pray and work for the conversion of sinners. During the past week, the Lord has greatly blessed us in the ingathering of souls. On Sabbath day, June 29th, Mr. Moody preached in 2 other chapels, and also twice in the Corn Exchange to audience numbering about 1,000 each. Each week evening service is preceded by a service of song, conducted by Mr. Moody's co-laborer, Mr. Sankey, whose hymns, tunes, and voice, like those of Philip Phillips, have drawn and impressed many. Mr. Moody preaches the gospel, Mr. Sankey sings it. Prayer meetings have been held every noon at the rooms at the Young Men's Christian Association, and many there have offered themselves and others for the prayers of God's people. Though this is the summer season, and we were under a disadvantage in consequences, though the miscarriage of others to and from Mr. Moody, of not having notice, and therefore were unprepared for his visit, when Mr. Moody dropped down on us on the Saturday morning, arrangements were made and bills printed, all in a few hours, and from the first the Lord has greatly blessed our brother's labor in the strengthening and stimulating of Christians and in the bringing of many out of darkness into light. Their visits will long be remembered in this city. The congregations have from the first been increasingly large. All denominations have opened their chapels and given us their presence and help. Many of the clergy also have heartily bidding them Godspeed. P.S. Sunday evening, 11 p.m. Just before posting this, let me add that this afternoon a large chapel was filled to hear Moody. A deep impression was made. I have just come from the evening service, where every aisle and standing place, the vestries and lobbies, even the pulpit stairs, were crowded nearly half an hour before the evening service commenced. The Holy Spirit worked mightily. Sinners in all positions in life sought the Lord earnestly, and Christian brothers and sisters of the Church of England, friends, and of every denomination, were constrained without invitation to speak and pray with them. I don't know how many, but over 50 gave their hearts to Christ. Mr. Moody will, if the Lord will, proceed to Scarsborough shortly. Writing again from York, July 14th, Mr. Bennett said that the American evangelists were still there, and that every meeting during the week just past had been attended with great blessing. One distinguishing feature of our brother's meeting, he said, is the Bible lectures which he gives on such subjects as the blood of Christ, walking with God, etc. The passages of Scriptures are previously selected and read out by friends in various parts of the audience. The chapel was crowded long before the service last evening, and many sought and found the Savior. We have had most refreshing seasons at our noon prayer meetings. We hope to continue them. Let me ask the Lord's children to pray that these meetings may become an institution in this city and be greatly used of God in the binding together of Christians of every name, in the deepening of their spiritual life and fever, and in the establishment of a great rallying center for organization and aggressive effort. Each public service was followed by an inquiry meeting, which at first was considered a novelty, but gradually became a great power in the work. Mr. Moody's manner of expounding the Scripture at once attracted attention. The Bible readings, which he had given in Brooklyn and other cities, were continued with great effect. Believers were aroused to a new interest in the sacred word. Bibles were seen at every meeting, and new methods of Bible study were suggested. Mr. Meyer thinks that no one has given a greater impulse to Bible study than Mr. Moody. During the time of his meetings in Great Britain, the Baxter Publishing House could hardly keep pace with the demand for Bibles which he created. He says he knew his Bible as very few have done, and was always wearing out Bibles, covering the margins with references and notes and allowing them to pass freely among his friends. His Bible school and Chicago seminary have filled hundreds of young minds with the same enthusiasm. In my earnest acquaintance with him, I remember how eager he was that I should tell him any new thing I had discovered in the Word of God. How interested he was, for instance, when I said that the use of the article in Acts 1 indicated that the scene of Pentecost was the same upper room where the apostles had prepared for the Passover. The first all-day meeting which Mr. Moody held in England was arranged by Mr. Meyer and himself as they walked up and down Coney Street, York. It began at 11 a.m. and lasted 6 hours, and an evening service followed. From its novelty, it attracted great attention, and it commended itself heartily to all who attended the services. First, there was an hour for confession and prayer. Second, an hour for praise. Third, a promise meeting, which consisted of testimonies on the part of believers to the fulfillment of promises in their own experiences. Fourth, a witness meeting, which was a succession of public confession of Christ by young converts. Fifth, a Bible lecture by Mr. Moody. And finally, a communion service conducted by Mr. Moody and 4 ministers. After 5 weeks of meetings in York, resulting in the professed confession of several hundred people, Mr. Moody went to Sunderland, where the meetings were even more largely attended. The chapel in which the services were held soon became too small for the audience, finally necessitating the use of one of the largest halls in the north of England. Mr. Rees, who invited Mr. Moody to Sunderland, was an open communion Baptist, the pastor of a Bethesda chapel where the inquiry rooms were held after the first meeting in the Victoria Hall. The weekday meetings were held in such chapels as could be secured, for there was more or less criticism to be overcome. It was said that there was only one minister heartily in sympathy with the revival movement. All the other clergymen were half-hearted or even active in opposition. During the Sutherland mission, a committee from the Young Men's Christian Association called upon Mr. Moody and asked him to speak before the young men. The invitation was readily accepted. The committee then apologized for not joining earlier in the work, explaining that their delay was not due to lack of sympathy, but to the fear that the association would be injured if its officers seemed to favor a sectarian work. When they came to a better acquaintance with him, they were frank to acknowledge how little they knew at the time of the spirit of the preacher. In Sunderland, as in York, special stress was laid upon the noon prayer meeting and upon the afternoon meetings. Here also an all-day meeting was held. It is interesting to read the impression which Mr. Rees had after working for a month with Mr. Moody and Mr. Sankey. Number 1, both these brethren are genuine to the backbone. Number 2, they are disinterested as they are zealous, and their zeal is extraordinary. Number 3, Mr. Moody is in the Mercurius, Nercurius, of the pair. Mr. Sankey is not the juniper or the orifices. The former is not eloquent but very fluent, not poetic but rhetoric. But he never talks twaddle and seldom utters a sentence that is not worth hearing. He is too rapid a speaker. Nevertheless, what he does say is sensible, forcible, and to the point, and not too long, which is of a great advantage. He is American to the core, in speech, intonation, and vigor. His anecdotes are superabundant, and for the most part, the acquisition of his experience. They are always apt, often most pathetic, and sometimes appalling. His earnestness is intense, his energy untiring, his courage leone, his tact uncommon, and his love for souls most tender. After the Sunderland mission, Mr. Moody began a new work in Newcastle on Tyne. He had now gained the sympathy of nearly all the ministers of the several denominations, except those of the established church, who, learning that he was not ordained, refused in any way to countenance the work. After a few weeks of very successful meetings, the editor of the Newcastle Chronicle, a Mr. Cowan, then a member of Parliament for that district, described the meetings in his paper, speaking of them as a wonderful religious phenomenon. On the whole, it was a friendly review and criticism of the work. This was an unusual notice for such a prominent secular paper, and Mr. Cowan's article created a profound impression throughout England, resulting in invitations to hold services in other cities. Mr. Moody had been slowly overcoming the prejudices against his preaching and Mr. Zanke's singing at York and Sutherland, but when he accepted invitation to visit Newcastle, the home of Mr. Branbridge, and whose invitation partly he was in England, he did so with the determination to stay there long enough to settle for all time the question which had arisen as to their method and motives. He knew that he could accomplish nothing among the people until he had their confidence, and this would be won most easily when he had the cooperation of the clergymen. On this line and in this place, if it takes all summer, was his spirit, if not his motto. The meetings were held in Rye Hill Baptist Chapel, seating some 1,600 people, and while they were not large at first, they increased rapidly. Mr. Moody preaches, wrote a friendly critic at the time, but the conventional use of the word preaching does not convey any notion of Mr. Moody's talk. He is a businessman, and he means business. Every word he speaks is meant to lead to a definite business. If it does not do that, he regards it as thrown away. Most people believe that there is a life beyond the grave, and that there is some way of salvation and some way of being lost forever. And this is rather important business after all. Mr. Moody goes into the heart of this matter at once, and he puts it in a business way. He says he himself has salvation. In fact, is saved forever by the Son of God, and that every soul that wants it may have it too, at once, and know it, and go home with it, and be as happy as he likes. A good many, if not all, of the really earnest ministers of all denominations endorse as perfectly true what he says, although it is put in a new way. But better than all, he takes a stand by the Bible and proves it. I think this ought to be more widely known. Here at Newcastle, the same increasing interest that had been expressed at Sutherland attended the mission. The meetings were transferred from a church to the music hall, and there Mr. Moody and his friend Henry Morehouse, who had joined him, preached to the great congregations which gathered there. Educated people were among the first converts. Those who had known the Scriptures from childhood decided definitely for a religious life, and the work that started went down through all classes of society and influenced the surrounding towns. The inquiry room work was thorough, every inquirer being known by name and residence. As rapidly as possible, ministers and experienced Christian workers only were allowed to have a hand in this important part of the meeting, and they were admitted by ticket. When an all-day meeting was announced to be held at Newcastle on November 12th, many anticipated failure, but those who felt the reviving power and the love of God and had made this meeting a matter of earnest prayer knew that it could not fail. Not only did the people from Newcastle attend in large numbers, but visitors from Sutherland, Shields, Jarrow, and neighboring towns came in by train and filled the church and galleries. Business, home cares, and work, pleasure, and idleness had been left behind by the hundreds of earnest Christians who came to worship God and to hear His word. An hour was given to prayer and Bible reading, and the second hour to promises, Mr. Moody leading during this part of the service. Another hour was set apart for experience and exhortation, which was followed by an address by Mr. Morehouse on separation. The sixth and last hour was devoted to a sermon on heaven, preached by Mr. Moody. In the evening, a gospel service was held, Moody and Morehouse speaking. The chapel was filled to overflowing. After this all-day meeting, the work seemed to grow steadily. Mr. Morehouse speaks in this connection of four things which he had observed about dear Moody's work, as he called it. 1. He believes firmly that the gospel saves sinners when they believe, and he rests on this simple story of a crucified and risen Savior. 2. He expects when he goes to preach that souls will be saved, and the result is that God honors his faith. 3. He preaches as if there never was to be another meeting, and as if sinners might never hear the gospel sound again. These appeals to decide now are most impressive. 4. He gets Christians to work in the after meetings. He urges them to ask those who are sitting near them if they are saved. Everything about their work is very simple, and I would advise the workers in the Lord's vineyard to see and hear our blessed brothers, and if possible learn some blessed lessons from them in soul winning. At one of the inquiry meetings in Newcastle, Mr. Moody had an interview which he often related in later years as illustrating the need of confession and restitution. The inquirer complained that every time she began to pray, 5 bottles of wine came before her mind, which she had stolen when serving as a housekeeper for a gentleman. She had never been able to pray since. In reply to her request for advice, Mr. Moody said without hesitation, "Pay for them." "But the person is dead," she said. "Are not some of the heirs living?" "Yes, a son." "Then go to that son and pay him back." "I want to see the face of God," she said, "but I could not think of doing a thing like that. My reputation is at stake." She went away and came back the next day to ask if it would not do just as well to put the money in the treasury of the Lord. "No," was the reply. "God does not want any stolen money. The only thing is to make restitution." For several days she struggled with her pride, but finally went into the country, saw the son of her former employer, made a full confession, and offered him a £5 note. He said he didn't want the money, but she finally persuaded him to take it and came back at peace with God and the world.